Hello and welcome to Infinity. I'm Charlie Seraphin. If you've ever practiced a spiritual discipline, had a spontaneous psychic experience, or if you're just starting to realize your own mortality, you'll be interested in hearing what our guest has to say. He's Brian Wittine. He teaches and is the director of the Transpersonal Psychology program at John F. Kennedy University. Dr. Wittine is also in private practice in the East Bay. His topic this time is the subject of a research project he did several years ago titled Crises and Conflicts of Spiritual Awakening. What do you mean by transpersonal?
The word transpersonal was first coined by Carl Jung, a noted psychologist, Swiss psychologist, and it basically means to go beyond your personal self, to go beyond your personal ego. And this word was applied to a fourth force in psychology, which basically includes the spiritual dimension of human existence. In other words, transpersonal psychology doesn't stop with your ego or with your personal self or with your daily problems. It also includes your relationship to God or to the larger whole, whatever that may mean to you as an individual.
Is being transpersonal, if that's a correct usage, a conscious effort? Is it something that people always try to do, or do some people get beyond themselves by not even trying?
Both. Some people practice. Some people will use spiritual disciplines as a way to transcend their individual sense of self, their ego. Other people will have spontaneous experiences which will take them beyond the experience of being an isolated individual in this world. And those experiences may come very suddenly and spontaneously, and sometimes they can really knock people for a loop.
We normally think of spiritual practices as solutions and not as problems. But as you move into new spiritual arenas, you can create problems.
That's right.
What kinds of problems?
That's right. Well, one of the things that can happen is that spiritual practices very often will attract people who don't really have a very good sense of themselves, people who have a low sense of self-esteem or a kind of a hazy sense of personal identity. And when they go and become involved in a spiritual discipline, one of the things that can happen is that they can lose what little personal identity that they have to begin with, and find themselves floating in a sea of forces which may be new, novel, and sometimes frightening. You'll find this, for example, in a phenomenon called Kundalini, which is an energy of the body, a physical energy. People who begin to practice Kundalini yoga without really knowing what they're doing can actually raise this energy, and in doing so can frighten themselves because of the power of this energy as it shoots through their body. So one needs to be cautious about getting involved in this field, in spiritual disciplines. I think that a safe rule of thumb is to have a good sense of yourself before you start plummeting into some of these disciplines.
I think this was kind of drawn to the forefront in some of the writings of the 60s and early 70s, when some of the religious and spiritual movements were trying to go after the secrets of some Indian cultures in this country and the use of peyote and some other mind-altering drugs.
Right.
And people that had regularly practiced these rituals involving the substances were very comfortable with them, and it was nothing to them. But other people really got into some real serious trouble by not being prepared.
That's right.
But you're saying that even without some kind of mind-altering substance, you can alter your mind and to a frightening state.
That's right. There's a lot of research that's been done on meditation, for example, in which it's been shown that when someone has what a psychologist would call a borderline personality or a narcissistic personality, which basically means your ego boundaries are a little loose, it these meditation disciplines can make things worse, not better, and can make one slip backwards as opposed to forwards in developing a sense of identity.
Other than this, the certain type of yoga and meditation raising your energy levels to the point that is a little bit frightening, what are some of the other symptoms that people might encounter if they get beyond their, I don't even know what to call it, beyond their normal range of experience?
Yeah, beyond their normal range of consciousness.
Mm-hmm.
Well, the research that I did basically looked at a three-pronged or three stages in a transformational process. The first stage was what I called the existential crisis. It was not something that was not a new name that I gave it, but has been used before. Mystics in the past called it the dark night of the soul. And basically, this is one that I think many of the listeners probably will have had an experience of, particularly if they've arrived at the age of about 35 to 45. This is the well-known midlife crisis, or what Jung called the beginning of the second stage of life, the second half of life. But what many people who are writing on the midlife crisis fail to acknowledge is that it has a spiritual, at least a spiritual orientation, or can have a spiritual orientation. Basically, what happens in an existential crisis is that you begin to feel that your daily life is meaningless. You have the 2 cars in the garage, let's say, you have the kids, you have the nice house in the suburbs, you've got the good job, and you've made it to somewhere in the hierarchy of the organizational echelon. And what happens is that you begin to feel, hey, so what? What does this mean? It doesn't really mean anything. But at a particular point, people may be going to drugs, to alcoholism, to smother the pain of that emptiness, that feeling of rawness in their lives. Basically, at that particular point, someone has the opportunity to begin to consider that their existence is part of a larger whole. But that really demands that someone face the pain and the isolation and the experience of the emptiness that's there. At that particular point, someone also begins to look at their own mortality, at the possibility of their own death. And that raises certain fundamental questions when someone begins to face it. Questions that so far have not been able to be answered by a Freud or a traditional analytic psychologist or our politicians or whatever. I mean, it hasn't been able to be answered. So the only place where we can find answers to those kinds of enigmas, those kinds of mysteries, if we can find answers at all, are in spiritual processes. So the first one is that existential crisis. Another one that can take place is when someone has an awakening, whether spontaneously or not, whether it's motivated through or brought about through meditation or spiritual practices or not, in which one begins to feel like they're at the high, they're on a high. And they may have visions, they may have the Kundalini phenomenon, which I described earlier. They may have experiences of tremendous bliss. They may have moments in which they feel utterly connected to the whole of the universe, to all of life. Can be very powerful experiences. It's like going to the top of the mountain and realizing that you're one with the sun in some way. The problem with those kinds of crises is that there's an old phrase that I've used, which is perfection. The light of perfection brings imperfection to the surface. And what that basically means is that when you start shining light, which is what a transcendent experience is, into yourself, what happens is that all those nice little crevices and corners that you've kept hidden show up, so that you begin to see the cobwebs or the spider webs of your own unconscious. And that can be harrowing for some people. You thought you were all perfect, and all of a sudden, and you thought you were going to meditate and go to God. And what happens is light comes in, and you look inside of yourself and find all kinds of things that you hadn't dreamed existed inside. Mm-hmm. Your mother complexes and your father complexes and all that stuff begin to come up. And the mystics of the ages said, well, of course, the second stage of a spiritual process is to purify, to clean all that stuff out. So of course it's going to come up. But sometimes with spiritual practices it comes up too quick, too fast, and people don't know what hits them. The third phase in that process is when you've been up there for a while. You've been on the mountaintop, and you've been practicing your meditation techniques, and you've been doing your yoga breathing and all this kind of business, and you've had some remarkable experiences. And what happens is that you begin to feel like, so what again? The meditation stops working. You can't get any higher, quote, higher. Your meditation, you've practiced diligently, you're disciplined, you've been practicing it. And it's as though all of the lush, rich experiences that you've had through your meditation experience just completely leaves. And at that particular point, we call it the crisis of duality. And at that particular point, it's as though you have to come down again from the mountain, come back down to earth. And I think this is one of the things that many seekers in today's world are having to do, that we've been up there on the mountaintop for a while with full of ideals and full of God thoughts, and we have to come back into the world and deal with earthly reality. And that's the third prong of the journey.
That one is particularly troublesome, I think, for people who live in this culture, who have such a fast-paced, imperfect world all around them.
Right. It definitely is, because it's much nicer to be able to stay on the mountaintop and take the bird's eye view and not get really involved in the nitty-gritty of everyday problems of life in our world, of the nuclear issue and politics and so forth. Spiritual people would like to stay up on the mountaintop a lot of times. But I think that the main purpose of a crisis of duality is to come off the mountaintop, come down into the world, and get off the high horse, so to speak, and serve, contribute. These experiences that you've been having are not just for yourself. They can be used to help transform or change in some way the culture.
In the second phase, when people have the light shining in and they're seeing all the cobwebs and the little dark corners that they would like to forget or perhaps didn't know existed.
Right.
How do you go about in your teaching and in your private practice? How do you go about dealing with that? How do you tell people to work through that particular problem?
Right. Well, for me, as a practicing psychotherapist, I think that there are two important phases right in there. One is that I think that a person should be under the guidance of some sort of spiritual teacher, a meditation practitioner, someone who teaches meditation and who knows about the various traps and pitfalls that take place when you start doing meditation. And there are many people in the Bay Area who are very qualified to do that kind of work. You will find them today not only in the more avant-garde kinds of things that you find in that magazine Common Ground, but you'll also find them in the churches. And they can do spiritual direction. But at the same time, I think it's important that a person be in a good, intensive psychotherapy, because the material that begins to come up needs to be worked through. And usually people who are involved, people who are spiritual directors, don't know enough about the psyche. They know a lot about the spirit, but they don't know enough about the psyche to be able to deal with them, with the phenomena that begins to emerge from your unconscious. Just similarly, most people who are primarily psychotherapists don't know enough about the spirit, don't know about meditational practices. So you need really the combination of the two in order for a real holistic approach to be taken. But a lot of it depends upon what phenomena is beginning to take place. One of the main things that I think needs to happen is grounding. Someone who is out there in having quite a few phenomena from their meditation practice needs to keep their feet in the ground. And very often I will ask them specifically, how's your diet? How are you dealing with your work life? Keeping your feet in the ground kind of things. Mm-hmm. But there are also very specific things that you can do for each one of the different phenomena that come up.
I'm afraid that we might be selling one side of the argument, and someone out there listening that has considered a spiritual practice or meditation or yoga or whatever saying, wait a minute, caution, this may be hazardous to my mental health. Maybe I don't want to get into meditation after all, or maybe I don't want to do this or the other thing. What do you say to that person that's listening right now that says, wait, I'm not sure I want to look into those dark recesses?
Right. If you are going to practice meditation, if you're going to truly take this journey, you're going to have to face the unconscious. You're going to have to face yourself. That's what meditation does. Throughout all cultures, all spiritual practices, whether it be Buddhism, Hinduism, Christian mysticism, whatever it might be, all of them will, at one point or another, prompt you to take a look. Otherwise, why would you be doing meditation? Many people may be doing it just for relaxation. Well, there's a lot of, that's certainly one thing that you can do for relaxation. But if you keep at it, you're going to have something more than just a relaxed body. You're going to be looking for a tranquil mind. And this culture, that's a real plus to have. That tranquility of mind is going to take you, it will take you through. I should say, to get to that place of tranquility of mind, the norm is that you will go through this period of transformational crisis in which you have to face all the stuff, or much of the stuff, that you haven't wanted to face in your life. So it's exciting. I wouldn't say it's totally dangerous. I would say it's very exciting, and it's like taking a trip to Europe. You might say on a boat. You're going to meet the storms if you cross by the Atlantic, generally speaking, but you still want to go. You still want to get to Europe. So I say, let's go for the storm. I think it's very exciting, and it's very meaningful and useful.
What do you say to that individual? And I'm thinking of a motion picture, Close Encounters of the Third Kind, where a guy's driving along, he's pretty content, he's got his whole life together, and he's driving in a pickup truck, and all of a sudden he has a UFO experience, and the light's shining, and his face is burnt a little bit, and from then on, his family leaves him, he's building mounds of garbage, and his whole life is really transformed. That's obviously a Hollywood version of some kind of a major transformation. But are there people perhaps listening right now that have been living very normal lives, nothing really unusual ever happened to them, all of a sudden, bam, they have some kind of an ESP experience, or something really strange happens to them, and it just shakes the root of their whole being?
Very definitely. And we receive calls at JFK University all the time from people who have experiences, who don't understand them. In my own private practice, people come to me when they begin to have psychic experiences. I have a woman right now, for example, who began to have precognitive dreams in which she would have a vision of what the future would bring, including the death of a close friend of hers. And when the death actually took place, she was very frightened, was not sure she wanted this particular extrasensory mode of perception, and came to me in order to deal with that. So yes, things like that do happen. However, I think the norm is much less dramatic. I have really met very few people who are building mounds of earth in their dining room, on their dining room table. Rarely do I find poltergeist phenomena, although other people probably do experience that. I find that things are more non-dramatic. When the real dramatic kind of stuff happens, it's something to certainly pay attention to, but it's not particularly prevalent. It's not as prevalent as the more moderate kind of crisis. The existential crisis is far more prevalent in our culture. The crisis of duality is far more prevalent than these bells that are going off in people's minds in the middle stage.
Is that perhaps a function of the fact that ESP and some of the psychic phenomena are suppressed in this culture? That people here, we say, gee, Mary doesn't seem the same this week as she did last week, and she may never be the same again, but we don't really know why, and she's not going to talk about it.
It's our culture, it's our upbringing, it's our educational system, which teaches a child that those senses that I think are pretty normal in childhood are unreal. it's not consensual reality. It's not agreed upon reality. So therefore, you better get rid of it as soon as possible. So I think that those senses are normal senses, and that they are, in many instances, strategically or unconsciously, I should say, we get rid of them through our educational process. But they still exist, and they go underneath the surface.
What is psychotherapy, and how did we get to that point?
What is psychotherapy?
Yeah.
Well, the word psychotherapy to me means the healing of the soul, of its pain, of its trouble, of its pathos. And pathos to me is its suffering. So psychotherapy to me is a process by which we confront the seriousness of our life, that we are here on this planet. I don't really know about reincarnation. Other people do. As far as I know, at this particular point, this is what I got to deal with. Consequently, I want to make the best of it that I can possibly make. Psychotherapy is a way to take life seriously, to make your life more the way you really want it to be, the more the way that your heart really wants it to be. And it's a process by which the pain or the suffering that exists in most of our lives can be at least dealt with in a way which enriches our lives rather than keeps them feeling somewhat empty.
Where did it come from? Is it something that's relatively new? Because we hear a lot more about it in modern America than if you read the...
This is the psychotherapy culture right now.
Yeah.
And particularly in San Francisco. There are psychotherapists all
Did
over
Columbus
the place.
have a psychotherapist? He went through a lot of tough times.
The earliest psychotherapists, I think, were the priests and the shamans. The priests of the shamans of early tribes and the high priests and priestesses of the temples. I think these were the first psychotherapists. The Oracle of Delphi may have been one of the first psychotherapists.
Did these folks know what they were doing according to today's standards?
I don't know. I wasn't there. I think that the contributions that have been made by modern psychiatric practitioners is a very positive and important research. But it's not the end-all. Something you mentioned early on was that a lot of people that are attracted to various spiritual paths have some deficiencies, personal deficiencies. They really haven't worked out a good sense of themselves. Are really super strong people that really have it all together, drawn to without an ESP experience. The real stable people?
Yeah, the real stable, hard rock.
Just remember, we're all going to get old. We are all going to have to face the lines creeping across the brow. We're all going to have to face the fact, somebody's going to die sooner or later in our life, and we're going to look at our own mortality if we have any awareness whatsoever. That's a key point. That's that existential point, that turning point where you can begin to look. So, but I think you have a point, though, that very stable people who've got it all together are rarely drawn to some of these newfangled things. And I don't know. I have people that I know who are, I don't go to psychotherapy. I'm not sick, or I'm not going to go to a meditation. I'm not unrelaxed and all that kind of business. So probably have a point there. But sooner or later, the brow begins to wrinkle, and we have to face it.
What about spiritual leaders and spiritual followers? Are spiritual followers, in a lot of disciplines, you have to be a spiritual follower for years and years and years and years and years before you get to be a spiritual leader. But you can never imagine, when we've had people come in to this program that have been legitimate, bona fide spiritual leaders of various disciplines, you can't imagine them ever having been a spiritual follower because they just seem to have it all together.
All the charisma's all there. And, the light is radiating out of their eyes and their heart and all that, One of the things that I can say about leaders and followers, I have a great respect for people who are truly able to guide someone else on a spiritual path. However, I think my topic is in crises and conflicts of that phenomena, so I'd like to address that. One of the things that can happen in the guru chela, as it's called, the guru relationship with his chela or her chela, the student, is that the chela can begin to idealize the teacher in such a way as to project onto that teacher all of the student's own best qualities. So Freud called that transference. The defense mechanism is called projection. It's like there's a movie-making machine in your mind, and the film that goes through it is projected onto the screen represented by somebody else. Well, in spiritual disciplines, they talk about this inner self, sometimes called the higher self, sometimes called the spiritual self, the God within, the inner source, which is a living reality inside each person. And what can happen when someone begins to work with a spiritual teacher is that the image of your own highest idealistic self, or I don't want to say idealistic self, but your highest self, your most qualitative, virtuous, the
best you.
The best you, that's right,
Okay.
gets projected onto the spiritual teacher, and all of your power goes over to that particular person, so that he calls the shots or she calls the shots, and you have to be devoted. And of course you want to be devoted. You want to be devoted to your own higher self, but the problem is that you've got it projected over onto the other person, and so what happens is that there's this muddiness of relationship. So you have cult experiences, for example, in which one person is this remarkable charismatic leader carrying the projection, which is a very powerful responsibility to be carrying for all these different people. Eventually, and I think the best spiritual teachers will say this, that the projection has to be reclaimed, and the person has to somehow realize that who the guru is inside. Sometimes that's not easy.
In this messed up world with crises, even in areas that are normally thought of as very positive, like spiritual awakening, if there are crises in that, is the world getting better? Are we getting better? Are we coming through it? Are we growing? Are we progressing? Or are we just getting more muddied up?
Maybe both. I can tell you a little myth that might be helpful. In certain spiritual traditions, the myth is that this planet as a whole and this human race is at a turning point, and that there is a different energy coming to our planet from the center from a universe center, beaming out like a radio wave, beaming out and hitting our planet and touching all the different people that are here. And it's a very high-powered energy that's supposedly coming in. It's supposedly the energy that has been symbolized by this so-called New Age or Aquarian Age. It's stirring up everything in our culture. It's supposedly bringing the light in, but what happens when the light comes in is that all the little cobwebs begin to show up. So maybe, in this myth anyway, in this way of seeing, that this light that is coming in may be shaking us all up, and we're going through a worldwide existential crisis in which we're having to look at our own mortality, the possibility for taking a leap in consciousness, and with that, all of the shadows of our own past and the shadows of our present.
This is Infinity. Remember to keep your mind open and listen to your heart. I'm Charlie Seraphin. Thank you for listening.